the final scroll of Atlantis. Welcome to the Elysian Codex. There are stories that civilization tells about itself, and then there are the stories that civilization cannot stop telling, no matter how many times the educated and the cautious recommend that it stop. The story of Atlantis is the second kind, since Plato first described it in the 4th century before the Common Era, in 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, attributed to conversations with the Athenian statesman Solon, who had in turn received the account from Egyptian priests in the city of Sais. The story has never stopped circulating. It has been dismissed as allegory, embraced as history, subjected to the full range of scholarly analysis from the credulous to the contemptuous, and consistently proven resistant to definitive resolution in either direction. Nobody has conclusively proved that Atlantis existed. Nobody has conclusively proved that it did not. The story occupies a strange middle ground that is not comfortable for a civilization that prefers its answers clean. The discomfort is informative. When a story persists across 2.5 millennia, through every shift in intellectual fashion, through every revolution in the way human beings understand their past and their world, there are 2 explanations. The first is that the story is psychologically useful regardless of its truth, that it meets a need so fundamental that each generation rediscovers the need and reaches for the story that meets it. The second is that the story is true, or true enough, or contains enough truth that the people who encounter it recognize, at some level below the reach of deliberate reasoning, that the thing being described actually happened. The story of Atlantis has always had the quality of the second kind. The specificity of Plato's account, the dates, the geography, the institutional structure of Atlantean society, the nature of the disaster, the exact language in which the Egyptian priests described what they knew, is not the specificity of allegory. Allegory works by being general, by using specific events to point toward universal truths. Plato's account does not work this way. It is precise where imprecision would serve allegory better. It is geographically concrete where vagueness would make the philosophical point more cleanly. It reads, in the passages where it is most specific, like testimony. What follows is the account of a discovery made in the North Atlantic in the summer of 2019, and of the text found inside it, and of what that text, if the translation is correct and the claims it makes can be evaluated by the evidence that subsequent investigation has assembled, implies about the story that civilization has been unable to stop telling for 2,500 years. The discovery was made by accident, as the most significant discoveries tend to be. The text inside it was not an accident. It was placed there deliberately, addressed to a future that its author could not have known the shape of, left in conditions designed to ensure its survival across an interval of time that should have made survival impossible. The author of the text knew what they were doing. They knew who they were writing to. They knew with a certainty that is itself one of the most disturbing aspects of the document that the text would eventually be found, and they knew what finding it would mean. Chapter 1. The Discovery in the Deep. On the 14th of July 2019, a remotely operated underwater vehicle operated by a Portuguese oceanographic research vessel encountered an anomaly on the seafloor approximately 340 kilometers southwest of the island of Faial in the Azores archipelago. The ROV had been deployed to survey a section of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the vast underwater mountain chain that runs the length of the Atlantic Ocean, the visible surface expression of which is the volcanic islands of the Azores, Iceland, and a handful of other Atlantic island groups. The survey was routine work, part of a long-term geological monitoring program that the Portuguese and Spanish research establishments had been conducting jointly for several years, examining the rate of seafloor spreading and the volcanic activity associated with the ridge system. The anomaly was not geological. It appeared on the sonar data as a small rectangular regularity in an area of otherwise irregular seafloor, a shape too precise to be a natural formation, in a location too remote and too deep to be consistent with any known human activity in the historical record. The depth was 2,040 meters. At that depth, in that location, there should have been nothing made by human hands. The vessel's chief scientist, Dr. II, Marina Vasquez, a marine geologist from the University of Lisbon who had spent 20 years studying the geology of the Atlantic Ridge system, directed the ROV to approach and examine the anomaly more closely. What the ROV's cameras revealed was a bronze cylinder approximately 60 centimeters in length and 20 centimeters in diameter, lying on its side on a section of relatively flat basalt seafloor. The cylinder appeared intact. Its surface was heavily encrusted with the biological and chemical accumulation of long underwater exposure, the kind of accumulation pattern that forensic oceanographers associate with objects that have been in the same location, undisturbed, for very long periods. The incrustation's thickness and composition, when later analyzed, suggested an exposure duration of several thousand years. The cylinder had two features that distinguished it from any natural formation and from any known historical artifact. The first was its dimensional regularity. It was precisely cylindrical in a way that indicated machining or casting of a sophistication inconsistent with the depth of its burial and the apparent age of its incrustation. The second was a series of markings on what appeared to be the cylinder's end caps, markings that appeared, even in the limited resolution available, to be deliberately made. The cylinder was recovered over 6 hours of careful ROV manipulation at 2,000 meters depth. When brought aboard and examined in the ship's laboratory, the end caps were found to be sealed with a compound whose composition had no parallel in any known ancient sealant system, a material that had maintained the seal against the pressure of 2,000 meters of seawater for what the cylinder's external evidence suggested was several millennia. Inside the cylinder, preserved in conditions of absolute dryness in a chamber whose interior had been engineered to maintain atmospheric pressure regardless of external conditions, were 7 sheets of material that Vasquez and her colleagues spent the next 6 hours simply staring at. Not because of what they contained. They could not yet read the text inscribed on the sheets. Because of what the sheets were. The material was neither papyrus nor vellum nor any processed plant or animal material that any member of the research team could identify. It had the suppleness of vellum, but the density of metal leaf. Its color was a deep amber that became, at its edges, almost translucent. When held up to the light, the text inscribed on it, inscribed with a precision and a fineness of line that suggested an instrument rather than a hand, was visible from both sides simultaneously, as if the material had been manufactured specifically to carry text on both surfaces at once. Vasquez did what any scientist does when they encounter something for which their training has not prepared them. She took photographs. She sealed the sheets in an environment-controlled container. She wrote in her log, unknown material, unknown text, unknown origin, unknown age, significant. This was an understatement whose magnitude only becomes visible in retrospect. Chapter 2. The Material and the Script. The analysis of the cylinder and its contents took 14 months. The institutions involved were 3. The University of Lisbon, which conducted the initial physical and chemical analysis. The University of Oxford's Oriental Studies Department, which led the linguistic analysis, and a private materials science laboratory in Zurich contracted for the analysis of the cylinder's composition and the nature of the sheet material. The cylinder was bronze, a copper-tin alloy whose composition was consistent with the high-quality bronzes of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean world, the period roughly between 1500 and 1200 BCE, whose metallurgical sophistication remains underappreciated by non-specialists. The specific composition, the precise ratios of copper to tin, the trace elements present, was analyzed and compared to known Bronze Age bronze sources. The closest match, in terms of metallic signature, was to copper sources in the Iberian Peninsula and tin sources consistent with deposits in either Sardinia or Cornwall. A Bronze Age artifact, by the evidence of its material, assembled from Western Mediterranean and Northern European raw materials. But the dimensional precision of the cylinder was not Bronze Age in character. The tolerance on the diameter, the consistency of the cylinder's cross-section along its full length, measured at multiple points, was within 0.2 of a millimeter across 60 centimeters. This level of precision requires either exceptional skill applied with a patience and consistency that strains credibility as a description of practical Bronze Age manufacturing, or a mechanical process for which no Bronze Age precedent exists. The Oxford team noted this discrepancy carefully and did not resolve it. The sealing compound was the most baffling material. Its base components were organic, resins, a processed plant oil, a mineral component that appeared to be a specific naturally occurring silicate. But the specific combination, and particularly the molecular structure of the interface between the organic and mineral components, was not replicated in any known ancient or modern sealant system. The Zurich laboratory's report described it as a compound that appeared to have been specifically designed to maintain an internal atmospheric seal against external pressure fluctuations across an indefinite time period. A compound whose design implied a level of materials, science knowledge inconsistent with any historical period, whose artifacts could account for the cylinder's apparent age. The sheets were the most significant finding. Their material was eventually characterized as a form of processed biological material. The exact biological source was never definitively established. That had been treated with a succession of chemical processes to produce a substance simultaneously flexible, impermeable to water and gas, stable across an enormous range of temperatures and pressures, and capable of accepting and permanently retaining inscription without degradation. The material had been, in the language of the Zurich report, engineered, not selected from nature, created. The text inscribed on the sheets was examined by the Oxford linguistic team with the expectation, reasonable given the Mediterranean metallic signature of the cylinder, that it would prove to be one of the known scripts of the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoan civilization. Linear B, the deciphered Mycenaean Greek script, Proto-Sinaitic, cuneiform, hieroglyphic. It was none of these things. The script had structural characteristics of alphabetic writing, a limited set of base symbols combining to represent phonetic values. But the specific symbols were not derived from any known ancient script. The team identified structural elements that appeared to have parallels in several different ancient scripts simultaneously, a feature that suggested the script was not ancestral to those scripts, but rather shared a common ancestor with all of them. A proto-script, a writing system from which the known ancient alphabets might separately have derived. If that characterization was correct, the script was older than the oldest known writing system in the world. This conclusion was stated in the published paper with the maximum available hedging, in language that made clear the team understood the magnitude of what they were suggesting and wanted to be absolutely certain the reader understood that they understood it too. It remained, after all the hedging, an extraordinary claim. Chapter 3. The Linguist and the Key. The decipherment took 9 months and was accomplished by a linguist named Dr. Yusuf Adeyemi, a specialist in ancient Afroasiatic languages at the University of Lagos, who had spent 20 years working on connections between the early Semitic scripts of the Middle East and the earliest writing systems of sub-Saharan Africa, and who had developed in the course of that work a comprehensive model of what he called the Proto-Literate Horizon, the theoretical common ancestor from which the world's earliest writing systems diverged. Adeyemi had not been part of the original Oxford team. He was brought in after 8 months of failure on the recommendation of a colleague who recognized the script's structural characteristics as potentially relevant to his framework. He arrived in Oxford in March 2021 and examined the photographs of the script for 4 hours before saying anything. When he finally spoke, what he said was that the script was not undecipherable. It was decipherable by anyone who understood that it was not a discrete script, but a notation system, a method of recording phonetic values using a symbol set designed to be derivable from first principles rather than inherited from a prior tradition. This distinction was crucial. Every known writing system is, in a fundamental sense, inherited. Even the earliest known scripts show evidence of a prior notational tradition being adapted to the new purpose of full phonetic writing. What Adeyemi was identifying in the script, which he initially resisted calling by its eventual name, was a script designed from the ground up, without reference to a prior tradition. A script whose symbol choices were not arbitrary but logical, each symbol constructed from a small set of basic geometric elements according to a transparent rule system, so that someone who understood the rules could reconstruct any symbol from them alone. It was a script designed to survive the loss of the scribal tradition that produced it, designed to be rediscoverable by someone willing to treat it as a puzzle rather than an arbitrary inherited system. The key was in the first sheet, not encoded, displayed. A series of base elements followed by the combinations they produced, followed by the phonetic values those combinations represented. A legend placed at the beginning of a document whose author apparently understood that the person who eventually read it would need to derive the script from first principles. The author had left instructions for the translator. Adeyemi spent 9 months on the translation. He describes the work, in the memoir he is currently preparing, as the strangest experience of his professional life, not because the language was difficult once the script was decoded, because of what the language said. The text was a first-person account, not a philosophical dialogue, not a mythological narrative, not an administrative record. A personal account written by a specific person about specific events they had witnessed in language that was direct and concrete and emotionally present in a way that ancient texts almost never are. A person speaking across whatever interval separated them from the reader, with an urgency that Adeyemi described as palpable even in the act of translation. The account began with a date expressed in a calendrical system that took months to decode, and that, when decoded, resolved to a point approximately 11,500 years before the present. Plato had described Atlantis as existing 9,000 years before his own time, which would place its destruction approximately 9,500 years before the present. The scroll's date was earlier than Plato's account by approximately 2,000 years. Either the scroll was describing events that preceded what Plato described, or Plato's Egyptian sources had compressed the chronology and transmission, or the calendrical decoding contained an error that Adeyemi could not identify. He considered all three possibilities. He declined to choose between them. He recorded the date and continued translating. What the text said as it unfolded, chapter by chapter, page by page across the 7 amber sheets, would occupy him not for the 9 months of translation, but for every subsequent year of his professional life. Some documents, once read, cannot be set aside. This was that kind of document. Chapter 4. The author of the scroll. The author of the scroll identified himself in its second paragraph. His name, in the phonetic transliteration that Adeyemi developed, was something close to Theron, a name that would, much later, appear in ancient Greek as a common masculine name meaning one who pursues. Whether the Greek name derived from a memory of this name, or the two were independent developments of a common root, or the resemblance was coincidental, is not something the available evidence can determine. Adeyemi chose to call him Theron in his translation notes, and the name has held. Theron describes himself as a keeper of records, a title in the Atlantean institutional hierarchy that he explains was not a bureaucratic position but an initiatory one. The keepers of records were not administrators. They were custodians of a specific body of knowledge that the Atlantean civilization maintained as separate from its ordinary administrative and intellectual life. A body of knowledge that Theron describes as the long memory, and that he characterizes as older than the civilization he inhabited. Older, he says, than what his people called the Second Settlement, the period of systematic civilization building that his culture dated to approximately 5,000 years before his own time. He was 34 years old when he wrote the scroll. He had been a keeper of records for 11 years, having been identified as a candidate at the age of 18 by the senior keeper who was his mentor and who had died 2 years before the writing, leaving Theron as the most senior active keeper in a civilization that was, by the time he was writing, in the final stages of a crisis whose nature he describes in detail that occupies the scroll's central portion. He wrote the scroll over 40 days. He describes the writing conditions briefly. A chamber in a building he calls the repository, the largest of the buildings maintained by the keepers, located on the eastern side of the central island of the Atlantean archipelago, at an elevation approximately 240 meters above sea level. The repository, at that elevation, was above what Theron describes as the current waterline, a phrase that, given what he subsequently describes, carries an implication that only becomes clear retrospectively. He was writing, he says, because the alternative to writing was the loss of everything that the keepers had maintained for as long as the institution had existed. He was writing because the crisis had reached the point where the survival of the knowledge through ordinary means, through the transmission from keeper to keeper, through the maintenance of the physical collections in the repository, through the institutional continuity of the keeper tradition, was no longer assured. He was writing, in other words, for exactly the reason that the author of any message in a bottle writes. Because the message had to survive even if the messenger could not. Because some things were more important than the survival of the person who knew them. Because the knowledge, if it was lost, would leave a gap in the human record that nothing else could fill. Theron was not writing history. He was performing an act of rescue. And rescue, he understood, required telling the truth. Not the official truth, not the institutional truth, not the truth that the Atlantean government had been telling its population for the decade preceding his writing. The actual truth, the full account of what had happened, what the knowledge he held actually contained, what his civilization had actually been, and what had actually brought it to the edge of the abyss over which, by the time he sealed the cylinder and committed it to the water, it had already fallen. He opens the account, not with the catastrophe, not with the civilization's achievements, not with the political crisis that had consumed it. He opens with the location, with the geography. Because the first thing a future reader needed to know, before anything else could make sense, was where, on the surface of the Earth, this happened. Chapter 5. The World Before the Fall. The Atlantean archipelago, as Theron describes it, consisted of 5 main islands and 11 smaller ones arranged in a rough arc across a section of the Atlantic Ocean that his directional references place west of what is now the Iberian Peninsula and north of what is now the Canary Islands. The largest island, which he calls Atlan, the name from which the civilization took its own, was roughly comparable in size, by his measurements, to what is now the island of Ireland. The 4 other main islands ranged from large to very large, each separated from the others by navigable channels. The archipelago sat on a shallow submarine plateau, an elevated section of seafloor that dropped sharply at its western edge into the deep Atlantic. This geography is not Plato's geography exactly. Plato describes Atlantis as a single large island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, a description so physically implausible that it has driven much of the scholarly skepticism about the account's historical basis. Theron's archipelago is a different thing, a group of large islands on an elevated submarine platform, not a single continent-sized landmass. The discrepancy might be explained by the distortion of oral transmission across multiple languages and millennia. The island group becoming a single island in the retelling, the archipelago's total land area being misremembered as a single mass. Or the 2 accounts might be describing different things. The scroll does not engage with Plato's account for the obvious reason that it predates him by several millennia. The population of the Atlantean archipelago, by Theron's account, was approximately 2 million people at its height. The urban centers of Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BCE supported populations of comparable density. The management of 2 million people across an island archipelago, with the maritime technology the scroll describes, is not physically implausible. It is large. It is not miraculous. The civilization's history, as Theron recounts it, extended back approximately 5,000 years from his own time, what he calls the period of the Second Settlement. Before the Second Settlement, he says, there was a period he calls the First Age, about which the keepers maintained knowledge not shared with the general population and about which he will say more later. The Second Settlement began when a group of what Theron calls the descended people, a term whose precise meaning remains one of the most debated aspects of the translation, established the institutional framework that became the Atlantean civilization. The civilization Theron describes was sophisticated in ways that are specific enough to be surprising, and surprising in ways that are specific enough to be difficult to dismiss. The Atlantean economy was primarily maritime and agricultural. The archipelago's volcanic soils were extraordinarily fertile. Theron describes crop yields that seem large until compared to the volcanic soils of modern Iceland or the Azores, whose agricultural productivity is genuinely exceptional. The maritime economy connected the archipelago to trading partners in what Theron calls the Eastern Lands, the continental masses whose geography maps imperfectly but recognizably to the Atlantic coasts of Europe and Africa. Trade goods moving east from Atlantis included processed metals, chemical compounds that Theron describes in terms suggesting sophisticated metallurgical knowledge, and preserved biological materials of a type he does not fully characterize. Trade goods moving west included raw materials, timber, stone, certain mineral compounds, and labor in a form that Theron describes with evident discomfort. The governance of the Atlantean archipelago was neither a monarchy in the ordinary sense nor a democracy in the Greek sense. It was an oligarchy of knowledge, a system in which authority was distributed among a small number of institutions, each holding a specific body of knowledge and the institutional competencies associated with it, each having claim to specific areas of political decision-making on the basis of that knowledge. The keepers of records, Theron's own institution, held the oldest knowledge and had the greatest formal authority, but exercised it the least, because the nature of what they kept made active political involvement both inappropriate and, in ways Theron explains later, dangerous. The system had worked for approximately 4,000 years. It had produced a civilization of genuine stability, genuine prosperity, and genuine intellectual achievement. And then, beginning approximately 200 years before Theron's writing, it had begun to fail. The failure was not dramatic at first. Failures of this kind rarely are. They begin as adjustments, as pragmatic compromises, as reasonable-seeming departures from principle that each individually appear justifiable and that together constitute, when seen from sufficient distance, the systematic dismantling of everything that made the system work. Chapter 6. The City That Plato Remembered. The great city of Atlan occupied the southeastern coast of the largest island. Not a coastal city in the ordinary sense, but a city built to exist in intimate relationship with the sea, using the natural geography of the island's coastline in a way that Theron describes with an engineer's precision. The island's southeastern coast featured a natural bay, approximately 8 kilometers in diameter, protected on its eastern side by a peninsula that curved in a way making the bay one of the most naturally sheltered harbors in the Atlantic. The city had been built around and within this bay over 4,000 years, adding layers of construction to the original settlement to produce, by Theron's time, an urban structure of considerable complexity. What Plato described in a passage of the Critias that has fascinated and puzzled scholars for 25 centuries was a city of concentric rings of water and land centered on a sacred hill connected to the sea by a great canal. This description has been treated as allegory, as architectural fantasy, or as a garbled recollection of some actual urban structure that Egyptian sources had preserved imperfectly. Theron's account provides a fourth possibility. The city of Atlan was organized around a natural geological feature, a hill at the southern edge of the bay that had been the site of the original settlement and that, over 4 millennia of construction, had been elaborated into a central precinct of governance and ceremony. Around this central hill, the city had grown outward in irregular concentric zones, not the perfectly geometric rings that Plato describes, but the organic approximation of concentric organization that develops when a city grows from a fixed center over long periods. The canals that connected these zones to the sea were real engineering, not allegory, in a coastal city built on volcanic basalt that was, in parts, below the level of high tide. Plato's perfectly geometric concentric rings were, if Theron's account is the source from which Plato's account was eventually derived, a simplification and regularization of something organically more complex. The organizing principle was preserved, a city structured around water, centered on a sacred hill, connected to the sea by engineered channels. But the irregular organic reality of 4 millennia of urban growth had been smoothed, in transmission, into the geometrically satisfying form of the Platonic description. The telephone game distortion of oral transmission across multiple languages and 2,000 years explains the difference between the accounts without requiring either to be entirely false. The central precinct, the hill and the buildings occupying it, was the location of the repository that Theron describes as his workplace and the place where he wrote the scroll. The repository was the largest building on the hill, secure, isolated from the city's ordinary life, its function, the maintenance of the keeper's collections in conditions of both physical preservation and social separation. Access was controlled not by locks. Theron mentions no locks, but by convention and the social sanction that the Atlantean culture attached to violations of the keeper's space. In a civilization of 2 million people who maintained complex institutional relationships across 5 islands and 11 millennia of accumulated custom, it was unnecessary to lock the doors of a building whose inviolability was a foundation stone of the entire social order, until it became necessary to lock them. The city supported approximately 300,000 people in the main urban area, with another 300,000 in agricultural and fishing settlements that surrounded it. The remaining population, approximately 1.5 million, was distributed across the other 4 main islands and the 11 smaller ones, in settlements ranging from modest fishing communities to the second and third largest cities, which supported populations of 150,000 and 100,000 respectively. For a pre-industrial civilization, this was a sophisticated urban system. Maintaining it required a maritime infrastructure, boats, navigational knowledge, trade networks, of a quality that Theron characterizes with the matter-of-fact familiarity of someone for whom blue water navigation across the Atlantic is an ordinary fact of life. The Atlanteans crossed the Atlantic, not occasionally but routinely. The eastern coast of what is now the American continent was known to them. Not settled in any permanent sense, not heavily exploited, but known, documented, charted, visited. They knew the shape of the world. In other words, at a time when the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean were still working out the shape of the Eastern Mediterranean. This is not the most surprising thing that the scroll contains, but it is the detail that most consistently produces the reaction that the scroll's contents overall produce. The sensation that the world you thought you understood is slightly but irrevocably larger than you believed. Chapter 7. The Three Bodies of Knowledge. The keepers of records maintained three separate bodies of knowledge. Theron is explicit about this. He describes the structure of the keeper's institution with the organizational precision of someone who has been immersed in it for 11 years and who wants the person reading his account to understand exactly what was being maintained and why the structure took the form it did. The first body of knowledge he calls the working knowledge. It was the largest, the most practically applicable, and the most widely shared, not with the general population but with the other governing institutions of the Atlantean civilization. It included the full record of Atlantean history going back to the Second Settlement, including administrative, economic, and political records of 4,000 years of organized civilization, the complete navigational knowledge of the Atlantic and its coastal systems, including charts, seasonal wind patterns, current maps, and the knowledge of specific landing points, water sources, and safe anchorages across the Atlantic world, the accumulated agricultural and biological knowledge of 4,000 years of systematic practice, and what Theron calls the engineering record, the technical knowledge that underlay the city's infrastructure, its maritime technology, its metallurgy, and its management of the volcanic geology. The working knowledge was large, occupying, by Theron's account, the majority of the repository's physical storage. This was the knowledge that made the Atlantean civilization function, valuable, practical, and, by the standards of the civilization's history, relatively secure. Lost knowledge could be reconstructed from institutional memory and from surviving practitioners of its associated skills. The working knowledge was replaceable in a way the other two bodies were not. The second body of knowledge he calls the observatory knowledge. It was smaller, more specialized, and less widely shared, maintained by the keepers, but used primarily by a small group of specialists whose institutional function was the study of the sky. 3,000 years of systematic astronomical observation, maintained with the organizational discipline of an institution that had the cultural and material resources to sustain a project across a timescale no individual human life could encompass, had produced a body of knowledge about the cycles of the sky that Theron describes with a reverence, suggesting it held a special place in the keepers' understanding of their own work. The Atlanteans knew the length of the solar year to a precision that modern astronomy would not surpass until the Renaissance. They knew the cycles of the planets with an accuracy that 3,000 years of systematic observation had allowed them to refine to the level of the individual day. And they knew. Theron is specific about this, and the specificity is one of the most significant details in the scroll. The cycle of the Earth's axial precession, the 25,800-year cycle through which the Earth's rotational axis traces its slow circle against the background of the stars, producing the phenomenon that astronomers call the precession of the equinoxes, and that the ancient world knew as the Great Year. They had been observing it long enough to have measured it accurately, and they knew, therefore, that the world had been through many great years before their own civilization existed. Many cycles of roughly 26,000 years, each producing changes in the distribution of land and sea, in patterns of climate, in the conditions that made specific regions hospitable or inhospitable. The observatory knowledge connected the Atlanteans, intellectually, to a timescale that made their own civilization look very recent. The third body of knowledge is the one that Theron approaches with the most evident care, the most deliberate circumspection, and the clearest sense that what he's about to describe is simultaneously the most important and the most dangerous thing in the scroll. He calls it the first knowledge. And he says it did not originate with the Atlanteans. Chapter 8. The first knowledge. The first knowledge, in Theron's account, was older than the Atlantean civilization, older than the second settlement, older, he implies without stating directly, than the earliest human civilization whose records the keepers possessed. He describes its origin in terms that are simultaneously the most specific and the most opaque passages in the scroll. Specific in the sense of providing concrete details, Opaque in the sense that the details belong to a framework of understanding that the reader does not share and cannot easily reconstruct. The first knowledge had been brought to the Atlantean archipelago, Theron says, by the people he calls the Descended Ones, the same phrase he used earlier to describe the founders of the second settlement. The Descended Ones are described not as a separate species or a supernatural class of beings, but as human beings, fully, unreservedly human. Theron is explicit about this. Who came to the archipelago from what he describes as a place apart, a place set aside, a location whose geography he characterizes in language that appears to struggle against the limits of available vocabulary, as removed from the ordinary geography of the world in a way his words cannot quite express. What the Descended Ones brought, the first knowledge, was a body of understanding about the nature of the physical world, the nature of consciousness, and the relationship between the two, that the Atlantean civilization had maintained in the Keeper's archive for 5,000 years without fully understanding it. This is Theron's own admission. He says, with a directness characteristic of his writing style throughout, that the Keepers had maintained the first knowledge for 5,000 years, had studied it for 5,000 years, had applied what they could understand of it for 5,000 years, and had not succeeded in understanding all of it. Certain portions remained opaque, not because the Keepers were insufficiently intelligent or dedicated, but because the first knowledge contained knowledge of processes and principles for which their civilization had not yet developed the experimental and observational infrastructure to verify. What they could understand and apply, they did. And what they applied had shaped the Atlantean civilization in ways that distinguished it from the civilizations of the eastern lands that the Atlanteans traded with and occasionally influenced. The most directly applied portion of the first knowledge was what Theron calls the materials understanding, a systematic account of the properties of physical substances, organized not by the categories of natural observation, but by a framework of underlying principles that his description maps, imperfectly but recognizably, onto something like atomic theory. The materials understanding treated physical substances as composed of smaller constituents whose combinations and arrangements determined the macroscopic properties of the substance. It provided principles for predicting what combinations would produce specific properties. And it provided methods, chemical and mechanical methods, for controlling those combinations to produce desired properties. This is why the cylinder's alloy composition was so precise. This is why the sealing compound had no parallel in any known ancient or modern materials science. This is why the sheet material was engineered in a way that no natural material selection process could have produced. The Atlantean civilization had access to a material science whose theoretical basis was not rediscovered by Western science until the 19th century. They did not have electricity. Theron's description of their technology nowhere implies anything requiring electrical power or electronic control. What they had was chemistry, systematic, principled, theoretically grounded chemistry. At a level of sophistication the modern world reached approximately 100 years ago. The question Adeyemi sat with longest after completing the translation was not how they had developed this knowledge. The question was how they had maintained it intact across 5,000 years before the catastrophe. The answer the scroll provides is the institution itself. The keepers of records were not scholars. They were keepers, people whose entire professional identity was organized around the transmission of a specific body of knowledge from one generation to the next, unchanged, undiluted, available for application when the civilization's needs required it. 5,000 years of institutional continuity, maintained by an initiatory tradition that selected for specific qualities and trained to specific standards, had done what institutional continuity does when it works. It had kept the knowledge alive. Chapter 9. The science that should not have existed. The practical applications of the first knowledge's materials understanding extended through every domain of Atlantean life. The most important was medicine. Theron's description of Atlantean medical practice is brief. He is not writing a medical text, but specific enough to be startling. The Atlantean healers understood disease in terms of the materials understanding's framework, as conditions produced by imbalances in the constituent elements of biological tissues, imbalances correctable by the introduction of specific substances in specific quantities. This is, stripped of its ancient vocabulary, a reasonably accurate description of pharmacology as modern medicine understands it. The Atlantean healers were not working by intuition or tradition. They were working by a theoretical framework that told them what kinds of substances would have what kinds of effects on what kinds of biological conditions. The life expectancy consequences in a civilization of 2 million people sustained over 4,000 years were significant. Theron describes a population in which reaching the age of 80 or 90 was not uncommon, in which death in childbirth was rare, and in which the infectious diseases that devastated the populations of historical civilizations were managed with an effectiveness he describes as normal, not as a remarkable achievement, but as simply what medicine could do. The next important application was agriculture. The Atlantean agricultural system used the materials understanding's chemistry to maintain and enhance soil fertility in ways that went beyond what traditional agricultural knowledge could achieve. Theron describes specific treatments of specific soil types to achieve specific productivity outcomes in language that maps to what we would now call soil chemistry. The volcanic soils of the archipelago were already exceptionally fertile, but the Atlantean system made them more so and made that fertility sustainable across 4,000 years of intensive cultivation without the soil exhaustion that ultimately destroyed the agricultural systems of most ancient civilizations. The third major application was in the production of materials for construction, for tools, and for the maritime technology that was the civilization's economic backbone. The cylinder that contained the scroll was the most durable example of what Atlantean materials science could produce, but Theron's description suggests it was far from the most sophisticated. The buildings of the central precinct used a form of stone reinforcement that he describes in terms suggesting something analogous to what we would call concrete, a poured material made by combining specific proportions of volcanic materials with other compounds to produce a substance harder and more durable than ordinary stone. Some of the buildings in the central precinct, Theron says, had stood for 2,000 years without significant degradation of their structural elements. And then there was the maritime technology. The Atlantean ships that crossed the Atlantic were not primitive vessels. Theron's description of their construction, the materials used, the structural principles applied, the methods of waterproofing and sail management, describes vessels that a modern materials engineer would recognize as sophisticated. The hull materials used treatments derived from the materials understanding to achieve flexibility and water resistance simultaneously. The mast and rigging systems were engineered using principles of load distribution that mainstream maritime technology would not systematically apply until the 19th century. All of this was the applied surface of the first knowledge's materials understanding. The theoretical depth beneath it, the parts that the keepers had not fully decoded, Theron characterizes as concerning processes at scales smaller than anything their instrumentation could directly observe, processes whose modern analog would be nuclear physics. He does not claim that the Atlanteans had developed anything equivalent to nuclear technology. He claims that the theoretical framework described physical reality at that scale, and that the keepers had known for several centuries that the upper limit of what the materials understanding implied had not yet been reached. They were working toward a physics that modern civilization reached in the 20th century. Whether they would have gotten there if the civilization had continued is something Theron does not speculate about. What he does note is that the question of whether the descended ones, the first knowledge's original sources, had already gotten there is one of the questions the keepers had discussed for 5,000 years without arriving at a conclusion. The evidence supported. The first knowledge was full of implications the Atlantean civilization was not yet ready for. That was, Theron suggests, possibly intentional. The descended ones had given the civilization enough to flourish. They had not given it everything. Whether they withheld the rest out of caution, or because the Atlanteans were not yet ready to receive it, or for reasons that the keepers could infer but not verify, remained one of the archive's great unanswered questions. Chapter 10. The Fracture. The Atlantean system of governance had maintained stability for approximately 4,000 years by distributing authority among institutions in a way that prevented any single institution from accumulating the power to override the others. This was not an accident. It was a design, the deliberate architecture of a governance system whose founders understood that concentrated power was the primary internal threat to any civilization's long-term survival. The founders of the second settlement had apparently understood this so well that they built the prevention of power concentration into the foundational structure of their governance system, rather than trusting it to the goodwill or wisdom of subsequent generations. The keepers of records held the oldest knowledge and therefore the highest formal authority, but were institutionally prohibited from exercising political power directly. Their role was to advise, to maintain, and to preserve, not to govern. The governing institutions held political power but were institutionally required to seek the keepers' guidance on matters touching their respective areas of custodial knowledge. For 4,000 years, this equilibrium had held. Not without tensions, not without conflicts. Theron's account of Atlantean political history is not the account of a harmonious utopia, but of a complex, contentious, fully human civilization that had genuine conflicts and managed them without catastrophic failure. The system worked not because it eliminated disagreement, but because it channeled disagreement through institutional forms that limited the damage any single conflict could produce. What broke the equilibrium was the discovery of the materials understanding's applications to a domain that the system's founders had apparently not anticipated, the production of substances whose effects on human consciousness were predictable, controllable, and politically significant. The discovery, Theron dates it to approximately 200 years before his own time, was made by a faction within the Council of Islands whose political interests had been frustrated by the institutional constraints of the governance system. The discovery was not the product of the first knowledge's formal transmission, not a development of the Keeper's systematic research program. It was an accident, a specific combination of compounds investigated for one purpose, found to produce effects on the human mind that the investigator immediately understood had implications far beyond their original purpose. The substance's effects included, in varying concentrations and combinations, enhanced susceptibility to persuasion, reduced capacity for independent judgment, altered assessment of personal interest and loyalty, and in higher doses, effects that Theron describes with evident horror as the dissolution of the individual person's ordinary relationship to their own will. In the hands of a political institution with territorial ambitions and a sophisticated understanding of the governance system's vulnerabilities, this discovery was not a medical advance. It was a weapon. The history of the subsequent 200 years. The history Theron was writing inside, the history in its final catastrophic stages, as he wrote, was the history of a civilization whose governance system was being systematically corrupted by the use of this weapon, by a faction that had decided the constraints of the existing system were obstacles to be overcome, rather than features to be respected. The corrupted faction's methods were sophisticated, incremental, and effective. They did not attempt a sudden seizure of power. That would have triggered the resistance mechanisms built into the governance system. They worked slowly, institution by institution, individual by individual, using the substance to make specific people susceptible to specific arguments at specific critical moments until the balance of institutional power had shifted enough that open moves became possible. By the time of Theron's writing, the Council of Islands had been effectively captured. The Maritime Authority had been neutralized. The Agricultural Superintendency had been split. Only the Keepers of Records had resisted successful penetration, in part because the Keepers' institutional isolation made them harder to reach, in part because the nature of their knowledge made them more alert to the specific methods being used, and in part because the senior Keeper who had been Theron's mentor had recognized what was happening 2 decades earlier and had taken steps to protect the institution. Those steps were the steps that produced the cylinder. The recognition that the institutional capture of the governance system would eventually extend to the destruction of the Keeper's independence, followed by the controlled release of the first knowledge to serve the faction's political purposes, had produced the conclusion that the knowledge needed to be preserved outside the institution that was its ordinary vessel. The dissolution was not Theron's idea, it was his mentor's. Theron inherited the project and completed it. Chapter 11. The Observatory and the Warning. The Atlantean Observatory had been watching the signs for 60 years before the governing institutions were willing to acknowledge them. This is one of the most specific and most technically verifiable claims in the scroll. Theron describes, in detail, sufficient for a modern geologist to recognize and evaluate, the precursors that the observatory's long-term geological monitoring, a program conducted alongside the astronomical observations, using the observatory site's fixed locations to detect changes in the island's volcanic and seismic behavior, had been documenting for 6 decades. The signs were geological. The Atlantean archipelago sat on the mid-Atlantic ridge, and the volcanic and seismic activity of the ridge had been behaving for 60 years in ways that the observatory's records of the preceding 3,000 years had not previously documented. The frequency of small seismic events had increased. The location of volcanic venting had changed, new vents opening in areas that had been quiescent, established vents becoming more active. The sea temperature in the vicinity of several of the smaller islands had risen measurably, and most significantly, the observatory had detected, using precision instruments installed at fixed sites and calibrated against 3,000 years of baseline measurements, a gradual subsidence of the western portions of the submarine platform on which the archipelago sat. The observatory had reported these observations to the governing institutions with increasing urgency as the pattern became clearer over the decades. The governing institutions had received the reports, discussed them in committees, commissioned additional studies, and consistently failed to translate the warnings into the policy responses they implied. The reasons for this failure were multiple and mutually reinforcing. The geological timescales involved made the threat feel abstract and distant. The economic and political costs of the precautionary measures the observatory recommended were large and immediate. And this is the part Theron describes with controlled anger. The corrupted faction within the Council of Islands had actively suppressed the most urgent observatory reports, because the costs of the recommended responses would have required redirecting resources in ways that conflicted with the faction's political project. The corrupted faction was not ignorant of the geological danger. They were aware of it and had calculated that the timeline of the geological threat was long enough that their political consolidation would be complete before it became unavoidable. They were wrong about the timeline. In the final decade before Theron's writing, the geological signs had become impossible for any informed observer to dismiss. The subsidence of the southwestern portion of the main island, the gradual sinking of land that Theron describes as measurable by the year, was visible in the changed waterline against permanent structures built at known elevations. The seismic events were no longer small and local, but periodic large events felt across the entire archipelago. The western shelf was showing signs of instability that the observatory's 3,000 years of baseline data had no precedent for. Theron describes attending a meeting between the senior keepers and the surviving non-corrupted members of the governing institutions, approximately a year before he began writing the scroll, at which the observatory's chief scientist presented the final, unequivocal warning. The chief scientist's presentation was not a prediction of catastrophe in vague terms. It was a timeline, a range of dates expressed with the appropriate uncertainty of geological prediction, within which a catastrophic failure of the western shelf's structural integrity was likely to occur. The failure, when it came, would produce the rapid subsidence of large portions of the submarine platform on which the island sat. The range of dates fell within the lifetimes of people already born. The meeting lasted 3 days. The decisions taken at it were the decisions that produced the 40 days of writing that produced the scroll. Chapter 12. The Decision to Preserve. The question the senior keepers faced, in the year before Theron began writing, was not whether to try to save the civilization. They had already concluded that saving the civilization was beyond their capacity. The corrupted faction controlled enough of the governance apparatus to prevent any response adequate to the threat. The population of the archipelago was too large, and the infrastructure for mass evacuation too limited for any organized response to produce more than a small fraction of the civilization's survival. They were not making decisions about survival in the broad sense. They were making decisions about what to save, how, in what form, and where to send it. The keepers had the advantage, relative to the general population and even the non-corrupted governing institutions, of a longer perspective on what was actually important. 5,000 years of maintaining the civilization's knowledge had given them a framework for distinguishing between what was valuable because it was currently valued and what was valuable because its loss would leave a gap in the human record that would not close. The administrative records of the Council of Islands were currently valued by the people whose governance depended on them. They were not, in the keeper's assessment, what mattered most about the civilization. What mattered most? What would matter most to people who came after? On timescales, the keeper's long view made thinkable was the first knowledge, and the working knowledge insofar as it contained things. The post-catastrophe world would not be able to reconstruct from first principles. The maritime knowledge mattered, the navigational records documenting the Atlantic world. its coasts, its currents, its safe passages, mattered because the people rebuilding in the aftermath of the catastrophe would be building in a world that the existing maps of the Eastern civilizations did not fully document. The medical knowledge mattered because the specific pharmaceutical applications of the material's understanding had no parallel in any other civilization and could not be reconstructed without the theoretical framework that produced them. The agricultural knowledge mattered in principle, though its specific techniques for volcanic soil chemistry were not directly transferable to the soil systems of the eastern lands. And the observatory knowledge mattered. The astronomical records, the understanding of the great year's cycle, the specific knowledge of the sky's behavior over 3,000 years of systematic observation, because the people who came after would need, eventually, to understand the scale of the process that had destroyed the civilization. And that understanding required the long record that only 3,000 years of systematic observation could provide. The keepers spent 3 weeks in a process that Theron describes as triage, the systematic assessment of what could be preserved and what could not, what would survive the transmission process and what would not, what was critical and what was valuable, but replaceable. The process was painful. Every category of knowledge placed in the not critical column was knowledge that someone had spent their career maintaining, knowledge that had value and meaning within the civilization that would not survive to maintain it. The assessments required the clear-eyed willingness to set aside sentimental attachment to institutional products that is difficult for any institution to achieve, and that the keepers achieved, by Theron's account, with a speed suggesting they had been thinking about this possibility for longer than they acknowledged. The result was a list of what needed to be preserved and a set of decisions about how. The scroll in the cylinder was not the primary preservation mechanism, it was the index, the map, the document whose purpose was to tell whoever found it what existed and where to look for the actual preserved knowledge. Chapter 13. The Dispersal. The dispersal of the Keeper's archive began 60 days before the geological event that ended the civilization. Theron describes the logistics with the precision of someone who managed them. The challenge was transporting, in secrecy, a large volume of physical material, documents, instruments, the physical substrates in which the Keeper's knowledge was encoded, from the repository on the central hill of the city of Atlan to a series of destinations outside the archipelago, in a period when the corrupted faction's control of the maritime infrastructure made open large-scale shipping impossible. The solution was small ships, individual vessels, each carrying a specific portion of the archive, each dispatched to a specific destination by a specific route, none of them carrying enough to be, on its own, the most critical cargo. Individual voyages were not suspicious. Small ships moved constantly between the archipelago and the eastern lands, carrying the ordinary commerce of the maritime economy. A few additional small ships over 60 days were unremarkable. The destinations were chosen by the keepers on the basis of 3 criteria. First, physical durability. The destination needed to be a location where physical documents could survive in conditions of reasonable preservation. Second, institutional stability. The destination needed to be associated with an institution likely to persist across the timescale of the crisis and its aftermath. Third, receptivity. The institution at the destination needed to be one whose people would recognize what they were receiving as significant and would take its preservation seriously, even if they could not immediately access its full meaning. The Eastern Mediterranean priestly traditions met all 3 criteria better than any other available option. The priests of Egypt, of the temple complexes that maintained the accumulated knowledge of one of the oldest organized civilizations in the Eastern world, had the physical infrastructure, the institutional stability, and the intellectual framework to receive what the keepers were sending and to understand that it mattered. They had traded with the Atlanteans long enough that the relationship of trust required for this transmission was real, not invented for the occasion. Theron describes 3 primary destinations for the main archive: a temple complex in the Egyptian delta whose geographic reference, Adeyemi's translation, places in the vicinity of what is now the Nile Delta region, a site in what he calls the far western peninsula, whose geography maps to the Iberian Peninsula, and a location in what he describes as the Northern Islands, whose geographical references are consistent with the British Isles. At each destination, the arriving keeper was received by a counterpart, a member of the priestly or scholarly institution who had been prepared, through prior communication, to receive and preserve what was coming. The arriving keeper's role was not merely to deliver documents. It was to transmit enough of the framework to make the documents interpretable, to give the receiving institution enough of the first knowledge's structure to make what they were receiving something more than opaque text. Theron describes this transmission as partial and imperfect. The receiving institutions could not be given the full training of a keeper of records. There was not time, and their own institutional frameworks did not create the conditions for it. What they received was enough to know that they had received something important, enough to understand its broad categories and organizational logic, and enough to know that they should maintain it and make it available to anyone who demonstrated in the future the knowledge required to ask for it. This is the mechanism by which the first knowledge survived the fall of Atlantis, not in intact form, but in fragments, in partial transmissions, in seeds that Theron hoped would be developed by someone who had the patience and circumstances to reconstruct what had been distributed. The priestly traditions of Egypt received enough of the astronomical knowledge to produce, over the following millennia, an astronomical sophistication that historians of ancient science have long found puzzling in its precocity. It does not develop gradually from a simpler baseline. It appears, in the earliest available records, already sophisticated, as if someone had arrived with a head start. The Western Peninsula received enough of the materials knowledge to produce the metallurgical traditions of the Iberian Bronze Age, traditions whose sophistication has long been difficult to explain in terms of independent local development. The Northern Islands received something whose nature Theron is least specific about, characterizing it in terms that seem to concern the organizational and social knowledge, the governance knowledge, that had made the Atlantean system work for 4,000 years. Chapter 14. The Final Night. The geological event that Theron describes in the scroll's most harrowing section was not instantaneous. This is important. Popular imagination of the Atlantis catastrophe tends toward the dramatic and the sudden, a civilization swallowed by the sea in a night and a day, there one moment and gone the next. This is the version that has emotional power and narrative clarity. What Theron describes is different, not less devastating, but different in its temporality. A process, not an event. The process began with a seismic sequence, not a single large earthquake, but a rapid succession of events over approximately 6 hours, each progressively larger, each originating from the western edge of the submarine platform on which the archipelago sat. The sixth and largest of the seismic events produced damage to every building in the city of Athlon, the collapse of a significant portion of the southern harbor's infrastructure, and the triggering of what Theron describes as a wave from the west, a description consistent with what modern oceanography would call a tsunami generated by submarine slope failure. The wave arrived approximately 2 hours after the largest seismic event. Theron describes it from the repository on the central hill at an elevation of approximately 240 meters, enough to be above its reach, but close enough to see its effects on the city below. The harbor area, the lower city, the coastal settlements, everything at an elevation below approximately 30 meters was reached by the wave. There were multiple surges over approximately 4 hours, the largest Theron estimates at a height between 30 and 50 meters at the coast. The death toll in the initial event was catastrophic. The population of the coastal areas of the main island alone was several 100,000 people. The tsunami warning systems that the civilization had developed, signal fires on the heights, horn signals relayed from the observatory, reached some of those people. They did not reach all of them in the chaos of the ongoing seismic sequence in the darkness of the night in which the event began. But the wave was not the catastrophe in its full extent. The wave was the beginning. The western shelf failure that the observatory had predicted was not, in the event, a single failure. It was a progressive failure, a sequence of submarine slope collapses, each triggering the next, over a period of several days, that progressively reduced the elevation of the submarine platform on which the islands sat. The islands did not disappear in a single night. They subsided, gradually, with the terrible slowness of a geological process that moved faster than geology ordinarily moves, but far slower than the human intuition of catastrophe requires, over a period that Theron describes as lasting approximately 3 months, from the initial event to the final submergence of the last high ground. During those 3 months, the surviving population had time to leave. Ships that were available were not enough for 2 million people, but they were enough for the hundreds of thousands who had survived to high ground. Where they went is a separate story. 1. The scroll touches on but does not fully tell. Theron describes 3 primary directions of departure: east, toward the continental coasts of the Old World that the Atlanteans had traded with for millennia; north, toward the islands the Atlanteans had known and occasionally settled; and west, toward the continental coast that the Atlanteans had known as the Far Shore and that subsequent human history would call, eventually, the Americas. Theron wrote the scroll's final pages on the last night before sealing the cylinder. He was alone in the repository. The building was still standing. Its elevation and construction quality had protected it, but the ground had subsided sufficiently in the weeks since the initial event that the bay's water was visible from the ground floor windows in a way it had not been before. The city below was largely empty. The island was not yet submerged and would not be for several weeks more, but it was going. He sealed the cylinder at dawn. He carried it to the harbor himself. He arranged for it to be taken by the last small ship he could find to a specific location in the open ocean that he describes with navigational precision, resolving, in modern coordinates, to a position consistent with the seafloor location where Vasquez's ROV found it in 2019. He did not leave himself. The scroll does not explain why. It ends with the sealing of the cylinder, the arrangement for its transport, and a final paragraph that Adeyemi describes as the most difficult passage he has ever translated, not because of its linguistic complexity, but because of what it says. Theron writes that he is staying because someone has to know where the last pieces are, because the transmission was not complete, and the completion requires someone who knows what the complete picture looks like to be present in the location where the remaining pieces are, so that the people who come looking, and they will come looking, he says, because what was distributed will call people to it, can be guided to what they need. He expected to die on the island. He writes this without apparent distress, with the equanimity of someone who has done what they set out to do and is prepared for what follows. The island was fully submerged approximately 8 weeks after the last historical reference to the Atlantean civilization. Chapter 15. What survived and where? The evidence for the survival of the Keeper's distributed archive is the most contentious aspect of the scroll's claims, and the aspect that Adeyemi and Vasquez have been most careful to characterize accurately in their presentations. The claim is not that specific texts can be identified in existing collections as Atlantean in origin. That claim would require evidence, specific documents, specific content that does not currently exist in identifiable form. The claim is narrower and more defensible, that patterns in the early histories of several Eastern Mediterranean and Western European civilizations are consistent with the reception, in the period immediately following the geological event Theron describes, of bodies of knowledge whose sudden appearance in specific cultural contexts has not been satisfactorily explained by the standard narrative of cultural diffusion and independent development. The first pattern is astronomical. The astronomical knowledge of the early Egyptian civilization, knowledge embedded in the orientation of major monuments, in the calendrical systems documented in the earliest Egyptian texts, and in the cosmological framework underlying the Egyptian religious tradition, is, by the analysis of several independent scholars working over the past century, more sophisticated in its earliest forms than the standard narrative of Egyptian cultural development can account for. It does not develop gradually from a simpler baseline. It appears in the earliest available records, already sophisticated. The standard explanation is that the records are not the earliest, that there was a prior period of development whose records have not survived. This is possible. It is also consistent with Theron's account of what the Egyptian priestly institutions received. The second pattern is metallurgical. The Bronze Age metallurgy of the Iberian Peninsula is, by the analysis of archaeometallurgists, anomalously sophisticated for its period and geographic location. Specific techniques, the controlled alloying of copper and tin to specific ratios, the working of metal at temperatures and with tools that the standard narrative of Bronze Age technology does not fully account for, appear in Iberian Bronze Age contexts without the developmental sequence that characterizes the emergence of these techniques in the Eastern Mediterranean, where independent development is better documented. The diffusion hypothesis is not wrong. Contact clearly occurred. Whether contact alone accounts for the specific sophistication of the Iberian tradition is a question the metallurgical evidence does not unambiguously resolve. The third pattern is the global distribution of flood myths. Every major cultural tradition on Earth has a myth of a great flood, a catastrophic inundation that destroyed a previous world and from which a small number of survivors escaped to begin the current world. The standard explanation is psychological. The universality of the flood myth reflects universal human experience of flooding at the local level, universalized into cosmological narrative. This explanation accounts for the existence of flood myths without accounting for the specific shared features that appear across culturally unconnected traditions: the single surviving family or group, the divine warning received in advance, the high ground or vessel that provides refuge, the sending out of birds to find dry land. These details are too specific to be explained by independent invention of a common psychological response to local flooding. Theron's account of the Atlantean catastrophe, the warning, the survival of those who reached high ground, the departure by ship in multiple directions, is consistent with being the historical event that produced the flood myth tradition across cultures. Not consistent in the sense of proving it. Consistent in the sense of fitting the evidence better than the alternatives currently do. What the evidence does support is the scroll's claim that something was distributed. Something arrived at specific locations at a specific time. Something was received by institutions prepared to receive it. And something survived, in fragmentary form, to influence the civilizations that subsequently built on those institutions' legacies. The question is not whether the distribution happened. The question is how complete the recovery will be and how long it will take. Chapter 16. The Mythology. That was memory. The mythological traditions of every major human civilization contain, in their oldest layers, references to a people who came from elsewhere, from the sea, from the sky, from a place removed from the ordinary geography of the world, and who brought gifts of knowledge, civilization, and technology to the ancestors of whoever is telling the story. In the Sumerian tradition, they are the Anunnaki, beings described as those who came from the heavens, associated with the gift of civilization and with specific technical knowledge including agriculture, metallurgy, and writing. In the Egyptian tradition, they are the Neteru, divine beings who preceded the historical dynastic period and who were credited with the establishment of the temple traditions, the astronomical knowledge, and the mathematical and architectural principles that underlie the Old Kingdom's achievements. In the Hindu tradition, they are the Devas, beings whose interactions with humans in the mythological period produced the knowledge traditions that the Hindu civilization inherited. In the Mayan tradition, they are the creators who shaped the current world from what remained of previous worlds. The Popol Vuh describes multiple prior creations, each ending in catastrophe, the current world being the most recent in a sequence. In the Norse tradition, they are the Aesir, the gods who built the world's current form and who transmitted to humans the knowledge of writing, of warfare, and of the natural world. In the Greek tradition, they are the Titans, the generation before the Olympian gods who included Prometheus, the being who gave fire and knowledge to humanity and was punished for it. Every tradition, beings who came from elsewhere, a gift of knowledge, a catastrophe before the current world, a remnant of survivors. Theron's scroll does not claim to be the explanation for all of this. Theron is not writing mythology. He is writing history, the history of a specific civilization and a specific catastrophe and a specific group of people who tried to preserve specific knowledge against specific odds. But the correspondence between the scroll's account and the structural elements present in every major mythology is not something that Adeyemi, as a linguist, or Vasquez, as a geologist, has been able to ignore. The descended ones, the people who brought the first knowledge to the Atlantean archipelago, appear in Theron's account as human beings, fully human, who came from a place he cannot fully describe and who possessed knowledge whose origin he cannot fully trace. Whether those human beings are related to the figures who appear in mythology, whether the Anunnaki, the Neteru, the Aesir, the creators of the Mayan tradition are all, at some level of historical root, derived from the memory of the same people or the same event, is a question that Theron's scroll raises without answering. What the scroll does is change the question's status. Before the scroll, the correspondence between mythological traditions was an interesting scholarly puzzle with no clear resolution. After the scroll, if the scroll is what it appears to be, the correspondence becomes evidence. Evidence that the myths are not independent inventions of a common psychological archetype, but distributed fragments of a common historical memory. Memory of an event large enough and a civilization sophisticated enough to have left traces in every tradition that came after it. The Atlanteans dispersed in three directions. Their survivors carried their stories, their partial knowledge, their memories of what had been lost, into 3 different cultural streams that would eventually produce the mythological traditions of the Old World. The stories changed in the telling, as all stories change. The specific geography became vague, the specific institutions became divine attributes, the specific knowledge became sacred gift. But the structural memory remained, the template of who the descended ones had been and what they had brought. Because structural memory is more durable than specific detail, and because the experiences that produce structural memory are the experiences large enough to inscribe themselves in culture rather than merely in individual recollection. The story of the gods who gave humanity civilization is the story of the Atlanteans. Or rather, it is what the story of the Atlanteans became after 11,000 years of retelling across cultures that had no way to access the original account. What Theron's scroll provides is the original account, the event behind the mythology. The history that the myths were carrying, distorted but not destroyed, all along. Chapter 17. The message intended for us. The final section of the scroll is the section that Adeyemi describes as the reason he spent 14 months on the translation before concluding it, and the reason he spent 3 more years verifying the conclusion before presenting it. It is a direct address to the reader, not allegorical, not rhetorical in the classical sense, not a general address to posterity of the kind that ancient authors occasionally attempted. A specific, concrete, direct address to the specific person Theron expected to be reading his words. The person who had found the cylinder had understood what the material of the cylinder implied about when it was made, had undertaken the work of deciphering the script, and had read the account to the point where they were now in possession of everything the scroll contained. He writes to this person as to a peer, not as a supplicant, not as a prophet, not as someone addressing an unknown audience in vague and general terms, as someone who knows roughly what kind of person they are writing to, because the act of finding and deciphering the scroll has already selected for a specific kind of person, one with sufficient scientific or scholarly resources to find it, sufficient linguistic expertise to decode it, sufficient patience to read it, and sufficient intellectual honesty to take its claims seriously. He says, "You are reading this because you have the capacity to understand what I am describing, and because the world you live in has reached the stage where understanding it is necessary." He says, "The civilization I lived in reached a level of knowledge and institutional development that made it possible for a small group of people to use that knowledge to corrupt the institutions that had sustained the civilization for 4,000 years. The mechanism they used was a substance that altered human judgment and susceptibility. But it is not the only mechanism by which this can be done. Any sufficiently advanced knowledge of the human mind's operation can be used in this way, if the people who possess that knowledge are willing to use it without the constraints that the civilization's institutions were designed to enforce." He says, "The question your civilization is now facing is the same question mine was facing 200 years before its end, not the geological question. Your civilization's existential risks are different in kind from the geological risk that destroyed mine. The governance question. Whether the knowledge your civilization has produced will be used by the institutions that governance requires to be trustworthy, or whether it will be captured by a faction willing to use it without constraint for the purposes of maintaining and extending its own power." He says, "We failed to answer this question correctly, not because we lacked the knowledge to recognize the problem. The keepers recognized it 200 years before the end. Not because we lacked the institutional framework to address it. The governance system had been specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of capture. We failed because the people in the positions of authority that the governance system reserved for the recognition and response to this kind of threat chose, at the critical moment, to believe that what they were seeing was not what it was. Chose the comfort of the familiar institutional story over the evidence of their own observation. Chose to be wrong in the same way their predecessors had been wrong, rather than right in a way that had no precedent. This failure, he says, is not unique to my civilization. The long record the keepers maintained, 5,000 years of the civilization's history, showed the same failure in every earlier civilization whose complete record they had access to. The failure of the people in the positions of greatest responsibility to see what is actually happening, because what is actually happening contradicts what they need to believe is happening, is the most consistent pattern in the entire record of organized human civilization. He is not optimistic. He does not pretend to be. He has written a history of the failure of his own civilization, and he is clear-eyed about what that history means. But he is also not in despair. He made the cylinder. He arranged for the scroll's transport. He stayed behind to guide whoever came looking for the remaining pieces. These are not the actions of a man who has given up. He ends with a sentence that Adeyemi describes as taking 3 weeks to translate with confidence, because its grammatical structure is unlike anything else in the scroll, a structure that appears designed to communicate something the scroll's grammar does not ordinarily have the means to express. The sentence, as closely as the translation can render it, is this: the knowledge is not the point. The knowledge is the means. The point is what you become when you take it seriously. Chapter 18. The Physical Evidence and the Open Questions. The physical evidence for the existence of the Atlantean civilization, distinct from the scroll's textual account, is a subject on which scholars have disagreed for 2.5 centuries, and continue to disagree with increasing sophistication and access to data that previous generations did not have. The geological evidence is the strongest. The mid-Atlantic ridge, the structure on which Theron's account places the Atlantean archipelago, is seismically active, geologically young, and characterized by the kind of volcanic island formation that Theron describes as the foundation of the Atlantean landscape. The seamounts of the Azores plateau show geological characteristics consistent with having been, at some point in the geologically recent past, significantly higher above sea level than they currently are. The rate of sea level rise following the last glacial maximum, the period ending approximately 11,000 years ago, corresponding broadly to the date Theron gives for the catastrophe, was sufficiently large to have submerged coastal areas and, in specific geological contexts, entire low-lying island groups. The geological evidence does not prove that Atlantis existed. It is consistent with a scenario in which Atlantis could have existed, which is a weaker claim but not a negligible one. Consistency with the physical record is the necessary minimum for any historical claim about events this old, and the scroll's account passes this minimum. The underwater archaeological evidence is more contentious. A series of anomalous underwater structures, stone formations at depths inconsistent with natural geological formation processes, has been documented in the Atlantic and Caribbean in the past 50 years. Each has been disputed, explained away by mainstream archaeology, and maintained as potentially significant by researchers who find the mainstream explanations insufficient. The scroll's discovery adds a new element to this body of evidence, a physical artifact, unambiguously manufactured, found at a depth and in a location inconsistent with any historical period of human activity that mainstream archaeology acknowledges. The cylinder itself is the most significant single piece of physical evidence. Its composition is Bronze Age in its metallic signature, but not Bronze Age in its dimensional precision. Its sealing compound is without parallel in any known ancient or modern materials, science. Its contents are preserved in conditions that the materials science of the cylinder's construction alone cannot explain. The cylinder was not merely a container. It was an active preservation system using principles of chemical equilibrium that its Bronze Age apparent age is insufficient to account for. The sheet material extends this paradox further. The physical and chemical analysis has been, by the 3 laboratories that have examined samples, unable to characterize it in terms of any known ancient material production process. The material exists. It is real and analyzable. Its analysis produces results that have no parallel in the materials science literature. It was manufactured to specification, engineered for a specific purpose using principles the analysis implies, but cannot fully characterize. The open questions the scroll generates are significant. Whether the decoded calendrical date is accurate, whether the geography Theron describes corresponds to the Azores plateau or to another Atlantic formation, whether the received knowledge at the 3 dispersal destinations can be identified in specific existing collections, whether the observatory knowledge's astronomical records, if they were among the dispersed archive, might be recoverable from the early Egyptian astronomical tradition's anomalously sophisticated foundations, whether Theron's account of the descended ones, the pre-Atlantean source of the first knowledge, represents a historical tradition whose origins extend even further back than the Atlantean civilization itself. None of these questions can be answered from the scroll alone. The scroll is a beginning, not a conclusion. It changes the landscape of what questions can be asked and what evidence is relevant to them. It does not provide all the answers. Theron understood this. It is why the scroll's final section is addressed to the reader as a peer, not as a recipient of complete revelation, but as someone who now has enough of the picture to begin asking the right questions. The questions are the inheritance. The answers are the work. Epilogue. The world that was. The submarine plateau of the Azores, the elevated seafloor formation on which the modern Azorean islands sit, rises from the Atlantic seafloor to within a few hundred meters of the surface across an area of approximately 200,000 square kilometers. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. On the Azores Plateau, a 120-meter reduction in sea level would have exposed land area of several thousand square kilometers. In the 11,500 years since the glacial maximum, as sea levels rose and the geological activity of the mid-Atlantic ridge continued its work of raising and lowering the sea floor, that land has been progressively submerged, rearranged, and obscured by the accumulation of marine sediment and biological material that the sea floor accretes continuously. The world that was. The Atlantean civilization, the archipelago, the repository on its hill, the city around the harbor, the ships on the Atlantic, the network of knowledge that the keepers maintained for 5,000 years, is gone in the sense that it no longer occupies the surface of the earth in a form that can be walked on or touched. It exists in the sense that matter is not destroyed, only rearranged. The basalt of the hills is somewhere under 2,000 meters of water. The bronze of the cylinder is in a laboratory in Lisbon. The amber sheets are in an environment-controlled vault, and the knowledge encoded on the sheets is, for the first time in 11,000 years, in the possession of people who can read it. Vasquez is continuing her geological survey of the Azores Plateau, with a focus now on the specific area whose coordinates Theron provides in the scroll as the location of the repository. She does not expect to find standing structures. She expects to find anomalies, regularities in the seafloor that might indicate the presence of buried structural remains beneath the sediment and biological accumulation of 11,000 years of underwater existence. Whether such remains exist, and whether they are accessible with the current generation of underwater survey technology, is a question whose answer will take years to determine. Adeyemi is preparing the full translation for publication, not in a specialist journal, but in a form accessible to a broader scholarly audience. He has been in contact with historians of ancient science, archaeologists specializing in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, geologists working on the Azores Plateau, and, most recently, the Byzantine library scholar Elena Marchetti, whose work on the Ducas manuscript collection in Constantinople has produced results that the organizational notation in the Ducas manuscript appears to share structural elements with the organizational system described in Theron's account of the organizational system described in Theron's account of the Keeper's Archive. This connection, if it holds, would suggest that the Ducas library of the 14th century AD was not merely a private Byzantine collection, but a descendant institution of the Atlantean dispersal, one node in a network of custodianship that had maintained continuity from the catastrophe to the medieval period. The world that was is gone. What it left behind is not. The dispersed archive is somewhere, in fragments, in institutions that do not know what they have, in oral traditions that have been transmitting structural memory without the structural context that would make the memory legible. The cylinder was the index. Now that the index has been found and read, the work of locating what it indexes can begin. Theron sealed the cylinder at dawn and watched the last small ship carry it away from a harbor that was already beginning to look different from the harbor he had known. The subsidence was slow enough to be almost imperceptible from day to day and fast enough to be unmistakable from week to week. He watched the ship until it was beyond the range of his vision. Then he went back to the repository and waited. He was right that people would come looking. He was right that the knowledge would call them. He was wrong about how long it would take. But he had anticipated being wrong about the timeline. He had built the cylinder to last longer than he could calculate. He had written the legend for the script in the first sheet, knowing that whoever found it would need to start from first principles. He had done everything that could be done to ensure that what he knew would survive to be found by someone capable of understanding it. That person was found in 2019 on a routine geological survey, 340 kilometers west-southwest of the island of Fayal, at a depth of 2,040 meters by an ROV that was looking for something else entirely. The world that was is gone. The message it sent is here. Closing. For the listener. You have spent the past 2 hours inside the oldest story the human species knows how to tell. The story of a world before this one. The story of a knowledge greater than what survived it. The story of the gap between what we were and what we are, and the question of whether what was lost can be found again, and what finding it would actually mean. This story has been told in 100 languages and 1,000 forms. It has been dismissed as fantasy and pursued as truth and everything in between. It has never stopped being told because the people who tell it cannot stop. And the reason they cannot stop is not that they are credulous or naive or romantically attached to the idea of a golden age. The reason is that the story points at something true. Not necessarily true in the sense that every specific detail of the Atlantean civilization as Theron describes it will be confirmed completely by the archaeological record, but true in the sense of pointing at something real, that the human species has been through catastrophes before, that it has lost knowledge before, that the record we think we have of our own past is much shorter and much less complete than the actual record of what human beings have done and known and built. Theron wrote his scroll because he understood that the loss of his civilization's knowledge was not inevitable, that it was the result of specific failures by specific people in specific positions who made specific choices that they could have made differently. He wrote it as testimony. This is what happened. This is what we lost. This is what we preserved. This is what failed. He also wrote it as evidence. Evidence that the failure was not total, that the knowledge did not disappear entirely, that enough of it was preserved in enough fragments distributed to enough locations, that a future civilization with the patience and the tools to look could find the pieces and begin to understand the picture they formed. We are that future civilization. The tools exist. The patience is the question. What Theron preserved and what the institutions that received his keeper's distribution have maintained in fragmentary form across 11,000 years is not instructions for rebuilding Atlantis. It is something more fundamental, evidence that the version of human history we inhabit is not the full version, that the ceiling of what human civilization has achieved is higher than the record we have preserved suggests, that the questions we think are new, about the nature of consciousness, about the structure of matter, about the organization of governance in ways that prevent the concentration of power, are not new questions. They are old questions, asked before, answered before, with answers that were lost and that the fragments we have inherited are gesturing toward. The scroll is a beginning, not an end. Vasquez is continuing her survey. Adeyemi is preparing the full translation. Marchetti has been in contact with both. The pieces are beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to recognize each other across the distance of the centuries that separated them. Whether the reassembly proceeds quickly enough, and whether the civilization doing the reassembling is in a condition to do something useful with what it recovers, is the question that Theron addressed directly to his reader and that the reader must answer for themselves. He was not optimistic. He was not in despair. He was in the position of someone who has done what can be done, placed their trust in the patience of knowledge and the capacity of future people to be better than the past, and sealed the cylinder. The cylinder was opened in 2019. The scroll has been read. The message has been received. What we do with it is ours to decide. Appendix A. The complete account of the descended ones. Among all the questions the scroll raises, none has occupied Adeyemi more persistently than the question of the descended ones, the beings Theron describes as having brought the first knowledge to the Atlantean archipelago, and who are described as human but whose origins are placed in a location whose geography Theron cannot or will not specify. The partial account that Theron provides is embedded in several sections of the scroll rather than collected in a single narrative. He returns to it repeatedly, each time adding a detail or a qualification, in the manner of someone who is genuinely uncertain how much of what he knows is safe to transmit and who is working out the answer as he writes. The result is an account that is simultaneously more detailed than any other ancient description of this category of being and more deliberately incomplete than any account Theron provides of things he clearly knows in full. What Theron says explicitly: the descended ones arrived at the archipelago approximately 5,000 years before his own time. placing their arrival at approximately 16,500 years before the present. They were not the first inhabitants of the islands. There was already a settled population, small and fishing-based, organized in the way that small island communities in hospitable climates organize themselves, without significant institutional complexity. The descended ones arrived by sea. Their number was small. Theron says 37, a number specific enough to feel historical rather than mythological. They arrived in vessels that he describes as unlike anything the existing island population possessed, larger, differently constructed, made of materials whose production techniques the island population could not have known. They did not conquer. Theron is emphatic about this. The relationship they established with the existing population was neither violent nor purely transactional. He describes it in terms that suggest something closer to what a modern observer might call a knowledge partnership, an arrangement in which the descended ones provided knowledge and institutional frameworks, and the existing population provided something that Theron describes carefully as what was needed to make the knowledge work in this place. The phrase suggests that the first knowledge was not universally applicable in its original form, that it required something specific to the people who would use it, that the partnership was not merely convenient but necessary. What the descended ones provided over the period of their direct involvement with the emerging Atlantean civilization, a period Theron says lasted approximately 300 years before the last of them ceased to be present in the historical record, was the full body of the first knowledge, transmitted through a process of teaching that was simultaneously technical and initiatory. Technical because it required the transmission of specific information about specific processes. Initiatory because it required, in the keeper's account, a transformation in the person receiving the knowledge, a change in how they understood what they were and what they were capable of, before the knowledge could be effectively used. This last detail is one of the most significant in the scroll, and one of the most difficult to evaluate. The keeper's account of what the descended ones taught was not simply a transfer of information. It was the development of a specific kind of knowing, a relationship to knowledge different from the ordinary accumulation of information, in which the knower was changed by what they knew rather than remaining separate from it. Theron uses a word for this that Adeyemi translates, tentatively, as participation, a mode of knowing in which the subject and the object are not cleanly separated, in which to understand a thing is to stand in a specific relationship to it, rather than merely to possess a description of it. The implications of this for the material's understanding are significant. If the first knowledge's approach to matter required this participatory mode of knowing, then it would not be transferable through ordinary teaching, through the transmission of descriptions and procedures. It would require the development of the participatory capacity in the person learning it, which would explain the keeper's initiatory tradition, the selectivity of their recruitment, the length and intensity of their training. It would also explain why the receiving institutions at the dispersal destinations, however willing and however prepared, could not be given the full first knowledge in 60 days. The knowledge required a knowing subject who had been prepared to receive it. 60 days was not enough to produce that preparation. Where the descended ones came from is the question Theron addresses and declines to answer in full. He says they came from a place removed from the ordinary geography of the world. He says this removal was not merely spatial but temporal, that the place they came from existed in a different relationship to time than the world they arrived in. He says the keepers had discussed the implications of this for 5,000 years without arriving at a consensus interpretation. And then he says, in a passage whose brevity suggests deliberate truncation, what matters is not where they came from. What matters is what they left. The account closes with a detail that Adeyemi marks in his translation notes with 3 asterisks, his notation for passages he considers of exceptional significance. Theron writes that among the 37 who arrived, 1 remained, not as a specific individual who persisted across 5,000 years. Theron is not describing an immortal, but as a lineage, a continuous line of descent from one of the original 37, maintained through the keeper's tradition by a specific selection criterion that Theron describes without fully specifying. The last member of this lineage was, by Theron's account, his own mentor, the senior keeper who had died 2 years before the writing of the scroll and whose death had left Theron as the most senior active keeper. His mentor had told him before his death that the lineage would end with him. that the 300 years of direct presence had become 5,000 years of transmitted descent, and that the transmission was now complete, that what could be passed from the original 37 to the civilization that received them had been passed, and that the next phase required not continuation of the lineage, but deployment of what the lineage had maintained, that the scroll was what the lineage had been waiting to produce, that Theron's role was not to continue the tradition but to close it correctly by ensuring what it had preserved would reach the people who needed it. The mentor's name, Theron gives once, in a passage near the end of the scroll. It does not translate into any recognizable phonetic pattern. It is the only name in the scroll that resists translation, and Adeyemi's notes record this resistance without offering an explanation. Appendix B. The astronomical record and what it predicts. The observatory knowledge that the keepers maintained and that Theron describes as among the most important of the dispersed archive's contents was not merely a collection of astronomical observations. It was, in the framework Theron describes, a tool for understanding where in the Great Year, the 25,800-year cycle of the Earth's axial precession, any given civilization was located. This matters because the Great Year is not merely an astronomical phenomenon. The precession of the equinoxes produces real changes in the distribution of solar energy across the Earth's surface, changes in ocean circulation, changes in climate, changes that produce, over its full cycle, shifts in which regions of the Earth are hospitable to complex civilization and which are not. The Atlanteans, with 3,000 years of systematic astronomical observation and the much longer record that the First Knowledge's cosmological framework provided, had developed a detailed understanding of how the Great Year's phases corresponded to changes in the conditions for human civilization. The framework they had developed divided the Great Year into 8 phases of approximately 3,200 years each, corresponding to the precession through the 12 constellations and groups. Each phase had characteristic conditions: climatic, geological, social, derived from the accumulated observational record across multiple great years. The First Knowledge, whose cosmological framework extended to timescales beyond anything the Atlanteans' own 3,000-year observation could verify, described the characteristic conditions of each phase with the specificity that the Atlanteans had spent 5,000 years attempting to confirm against their own observational record. What they found over those 5,000 years was confirmation. The conditions the First Knowledge predicted for each phase of the Great Year were the conditions their observation found. The correspondence was not perfect. The Great Year interacted with other cycles, astronomical and geological, that produced variations in its predicted effects. But it was close enough and systematic enough that the keepers had concluded the First Knowledge's cosmological framework was substantially accurate. What this meant, practically, was that the Atlanteans knew where they were in the Great Year at any given time, and they knew what the observatory's 3,000-year record and the First Knowledge's longer framework implied about where the current phase was heading. The phase they were in at the time of Theron's writing was what the observatory's classification system called a transition phase, a period of change from one set of characteristic conditions to another, in which the stability of the preceding phase was dissolving and the conditions of the following phase were not yet established. Transition phases, in the observatory's historical record, were periods of elevated geological activity, of climatic instability, of the collapse of civilizations adapted to the preceding phase's conditions, and the emergence, eventually, of civilizations better adapted to the following phase's conditions. The geological event that destroyed Atlantis was, in this framework, not anomalous. It was characteristic. It was the kind of event that the transition phase of the Great Year had produced, in the observatory's record, in previous Great Year transitions, at locations whose identification from the historical record was difficult but not impossible. The Atlantean civilization was not destroyed by a unique catastrophe. It was destroyed by the kind of catastrophe that this phase of the Great Year reliably produces, at the location where this phase of the Great Year happens to be most geologically active. This framing does not make the destruction less catastrophic. 2 million people losing their civilization, their homes, and their lives is catastrophic regardless of whether it fits a 26,000-year pattern. But it changes the meaning of the catastrophe. It makes it not the end of civilization, but the end of a phase of civilization. The characteristic of transition phases in the observatory's classification was not only destruction, it was also emergence. The conditions that destroyed the civilizations adapted to the preceding phase were the same conditions that created the conditions for the civilizations that would adapt to the following phase. The civilization that would emerge from the Atlantean catastrophe would be different. It would be located in different places. The geological instability that made the Atlantic archipelago uninhabitable in the transition phase would make other regions more hospitable than they had been. It would have different technologies. The maritime technology that was central to Atlantean life would be replaced, in the initial phases of the emerging civilization, by technologies adapted to the more landlocked conditions of the eastern Mediterranean basin and the river valleys of the Middle East. And it would begin, as Theron understood, from a much lower starting point than the Atlantean civilization had occupied, from a baseline that had been reduced by the catastrophe to something close to the beginning, unless what the keepers dispersed reached the people who were rebuilding. Unless the fragments of the first knowledge, and the maritime knowledge, and the medical knowledge, and the observatory knowledge itself arrived in places where the emerging civilizations could receive them and build from them rather than from nothing. That was the bet. That was what the 40 days of writing and the 60 days of dispersal and the final night in the repository and the last ship from the harbor were for. We are living in the civilization that resulted from that bet. Whether the bet paid out at the level Theron hoped, whether the emerging civilization received enough of what was dispersed to build significantly higher than it would have from nothing, is a question that the history of the past 11,000 years answers in some ways and leaves open in others. We are more sophisticated than the pure rebuilding from scratch scenario would predict. We are considerably less sophisticated in specific domains that the scroll describes than the Atlantean civilization was. The gap between what we have and what the scroll describes is the measure of what was lost in the transmission, of how much the 60 days of dispersal managed to save and how much even that extraordinary effort could not prevent from being lost. Appendix C. On the nature of catastrophe and what it leaves behind. Every catastrophe in the history of human civilization has left two things: ruins and survivors. The ruins are the obvious inheritance, the physical evidence of what existed before, the archaeological material that subsequent civilizations excavate and interpret and build narratives around. Ruins are passive. They do not reach forward in time. They wait to be found, and what meaning they carry is the meaning that the people who find them assign. The survivors are the active inheritance. They carry what could not be written down, what the physical record could not contain, what exists only in the transmission between persons. The practices, the ways of understanding, the habits of mind and attention that constitute a tradition's living core. The survivors are the catastrophe's argument that what it destroyed was not entirely destroyed, that the destruction was incomplete, that somewhere in the wreckage something continued. Theron understood both kinds of inheritance. He was doing something about both. The cylinder and the scroll were the effort to create a physical inheritance that would carry further and more reliably than the biological transmission of a surviving population. The dispersal of the archive was the effort to give the surviving institutions enough to maintain a living transmission, not the full tradition, but enough of its structure to make the eventual recovery of the full tradition possible for people who received it. What he could not fully control was which of the two would matter more. The physical inheritance is more durable but less flexible. The living transmission is more flexible but more fragile. History suggests that the living transmission usually matters more in the short run, the immediate centuries following a catastrophe, and the physical inheritance matters more in the long run, when the living transmission has attenuated and what survives is the artifact rather than the practice. The cylinder in the Atlantic was the long-run bet. Theron was betting that even if the living transmission degraded entirely, even if the dispersed archives receiving institutions eventually lost track of what they had received and why it mattered, the physical record would survive to be found by someone with the tools to find it and the knowledge to read it. He was betting across a time scale he could not calculate, but that he understood was likely to be very long. 11,000 years was within the range he was planning for. The cylinder's construction suggests he was planning for longer. The sealing compound's design implies an indefinite preservation period, not optimized for 11,000 years specifically, but for as long as the chemistry could maintain its integrity, which the Zurich laboratory's analysis suggested could be orders of magnitude longer than 11,000 years. Theron was not planning for 11,000 years. He was planning for as long as it took. This quality: the willingness to plan for as long as it takes, the capacity to commit to a project whose completion you will not live to see and whose timeline you cannot predict, is one of the rarest human qualities and one of the most important. It is the quality that produced the medieval cathedrals, whose architects died long before the completion of what they had designed. It is the quality that produced the scientific institutions whose multi-generational accumulation of observation and theory produces the understanding that any individual scientist builds on. It is the quality that the keepers of records embodied in their institutional form, an institution whose purpose was inherently multi-generational, inherently committed to a project whose full realization lay beyond any individual's lifetime. Theron, at 34, sealing a cylinder and committing it to the Atlantic in the last days of a civilization he could not save, was performing that quality in its most concentrated form. He was not planning for his own satisfaction or his own recognition or his own survival. He was planning for a stranger he could not imagine, in a world he could not envision, across a gap of time so large it ceased to be imaginable and became simply a parameter to be accommodated. The stranger found the cylinder in 2019. The stranger could not have been imagined from Theron's position, in 9500 BCE or thereabouts, on an island that no longer exists. The specific form of the stranger, a marine geologist from Portugal, working with a remotely operated underwater vehicle on a survey funded by a multinational research collaboration, was genuinely beyond Theron's capacity to envision. But the type of stranger was not. The type was someone capable of finding the cylinder and reading what it said. Theron had designed the cylinder and the scroll to be findable and readable by that type of person. He had gotten that right across 11,000 years without knowing the specifics. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact about the entire account. Not the civilization, not the knowledge, not the catastrophe. The design quality. The capacity to design something for a user you cannot see, in a context you cannot predict, across a timescale that exceeds all previous human experience. The capacity to identify what will remain constant across that interval. Human scientific curiosity, human linguistic capacity, human pattern recognition, and to design for the constants rather than for the specifics. Theron was a remarkable designer. The cylinder proves it. And the question that his design quality raises, that it cannot avoid raising given what it accomplished, is what other things of comparable quality might be waiting for us. What other designs, made by people who understood that the present moment was not the final moment and who planned accordingly, are still out there, still waiting, still functional, still carrying what they were made to carry across intervals of time that should have made survival impossible because someone made them well enough that survival was not impossible. The cylinder was one. The scroll implies there are others. The index it provides points to a distributed archive whose recovery has barely begun. And the tradition that produced the cylinder, the tradition of the keepers, the tradition of the descended ones, the tradition that was ancient when the Atlantean civilization was new, may have produced other artifacts, other transmissions, other designs whose presence in our world has not yet been recognized for what it is. The work of recognition is the work that Theron's scroll has now made possible. Not inevitable, not guaranteed, possible. That, in the end, is what the final scroll of Atlantis is, not a revelation, not a solution, a permission to look for what has always been there, in the knowledge that looking is not madness, but method, that the search has a foundation in evidence, that the question is not whether something is hidden, but only whether we are patient enough to find it. The civilization that sealed the cylinder was patient enough to send it forward 11,000 years. The question is whether the civilization that found it is patient enough to complete what the sending began. Appendix D. A note on the translation and its limits. Any translation is an argument. It is an argument about meaning, about which of the possible meanings latent in a source text is the most accurate, the most complete, the most faithful to whatever the original author intended. This is true of all translation. It is especially true of the translation of a text in an unknown script, representing an unknown language, composed by a person whose cultural and conceptual framework has no living inheritors. Adeyemi has been transparent about the limits of his translation. He has published, alongside his working notes, a document he calls the Uncertainty Register, a catalog of every passage in the scroll where the translation involves a choice between plausible interpretations, where the underlying script admits of multiple readings, where the conceptual vocabulary of the source text does not map cleanly onto any available English equivalent. The uncertainty register is long. It is not, Adeyemi insists, an admission of failure. It is what accurate translation looks like when the gap between source and target is genuinely large. The most significant category of uncertainty is what Adeyemi calls the framework terms, the words that appear to be technical vocabulary within the first knowledge's conceptual system, words whose meaning cannot be derived from context alone because they are defined by the system they belong to, and that system is only partially recoverable from the scroll. Words like the term translated as participation, the mode of knowing that Theron describes as essential to the first knowledge's application. Words like the term translated as descended applied to the beings who brought the first knowledge to the archipelago, with connotations that Adeyemi identifies as including both the literal sense of having come from somewhere above and the metaphorical sense of having entered a mode of existence more constrained than their ordinary one. Words like the term for the great years phase structure, a term that combines astronomical reference with a qualitative characterization of each phase that Adeyemi translates as the feel of the time, but that Theron appears to use in a technical sense whose full meaning the translation cannot capture. The most important of these framework terms is the one Theron uses for the first knowledge itself. The term does not translate as knowledge in the ordinary English sense, as information possessed or propositions believed. It translates, Adeyemi suggests, as something closer to what the ancient Greeks meant by gnosis, a knowing that is simultaneously an understanding and a relationship, a mode of being in contact with what is known rather than merely possessing a description of it. The first knowledge was not, in Theron's usage, a body of information. It was a body of contact, a set of established relationships between the knower and the known that made certain things possible that were not possible in the absence of the contact. This distinction is not merely philosophical. It has practical implications for what the scroll can and cannot transmit. The scroll can describe the first knowledge. It can characterize its structure, its domains, its applications, its history. What it cannot do, what no text can do, is transmit the contact itself. The contact was what the keeper's initiatory tradition transmitted over 11 years of training in ways that left no textual residue because the transmission was inherently personal. The text can point to the contact. It cannot substitute for it. Theron understood this. It is the reason the scroll is an index rather than an archive. It points to where things are and what they contain. It does not contain them itself. The content, the living, applicable first knowledge, was what the dispersal was designed to preserve in the receiving institutions that were given enough framework to maintain it and enough context to recognize when someone arrived who was ready to receive it. Whether those institutions maintained what they received across 11,000 years in a form that remains living and applicable is the question that the recovery of the physical archive cannot answer. The physical archive, the documents, the records, the observatory data, can be recovered through patient scholarship. The living transmission, if it attenuated to nothing in the centuries following the dispersal, cannot be recovered from texts alone. It would need to be redeveloped by people who understood what they were trying to develop, using the framework that the texts provide as a map of the territory rather than the territory itself. This is the challenge that Theron could not solve with a cylinder and 7 amber sheets. He could give future people the map. He could not give them the territory. The territory was what the descended ones had given the Atlanteans 5,000 years before the catastrophe, in 300 years of direct presence and transmission that produced the institutional tradition whose last representative was Theron's mentor and whose last direct inheritor was Theron himself. The territory is what the next phase of the recovery must address. And the next phase is beyond the scope of any single text, any single scholar, any single institution. It is the work of a civilization that decides, deliberately, that the recovery matters, that the gap between what the scroll describes and what we currently are is a gap worth closing, and that closing it is worth the sustained, multi-generational, institutionally committed effort that the Keeper's tradition demonstrates is the only method by which knowledge of this kind can be maintained and developed. Theron did not know whether we would make that decision. He could not know. He put the question in the cylinder and committed the cylinder to the Atlantic and left the decision to us. The cylinder has been found. The question has been received. The decision is ours. It was always going to be ours. That was always the design. A note on sources. The documents referenced in this account: the Vasquez discovery log, the Zurich laboratory reports, the Oxford linguistic analysis, and the translation notes of Dr. Commerce. Yusuf Adeyemi are, at the time of this writing, in the process of formal publication through academic channels, whose review process has been necessarily extended by the unusual nature of the material. The author has had access to pre-publication versions of these documents and has represented their contents as accurately as the translation's own acknowledged uncertainties permit. The physical artifacts, the cylinder, the seal compound, the 7 amber sheets, are held in a secure facility at the University of Lisbon under conditions of controlled atmospheric preservation. Access for scholarly purposes is available through formal application to the university's Department of Ocean Sciences. Dr. Vasquez remains the primary contact for access requests. The seafloor site at which the cylinder was recovered has been marked in the Portuguese oceanographic records as a site of ongoing investigation. No further artifacts have been recovered from the immediate vicinity, though the survey of the broader Azores plateau area remains incomplete. The investigation continues. The translation of the scroll into the English language of this account is the work of Dr. Adeyemi, whose uncertainty register of translation choices is appended to the pre-publication manuscript and will be available in the published version. Any errors of representation in the above account are the responsibility of the author and not of the translation. Theron of Athlon, keeper of records, wrote his account in the 40 days before the seal of the cylinder. He was 34 years old. He did not survive the catastrophe he described. What he made has survived 11,000 years. That is all we know about him. It is enough.